there's a way in which both parties now are just vehicles for checking off lists that they've just been holding in their hand for decades. The Democrats have had them since the mid-'60s, the Republicans since the mid-'80s. Everybody's kind of forgotten how we ended up with this list and why. We just know we got to get it done, and that's counterproductive for both parties.
Yuval, a couple of years ago, you wrote the following in National Review, a quote, "Our domestic politics in the coming years will be focused intently on picking up the pieces of the terrible disaster," unquote, of the welfare state. Discuss.
Well, I think our domestic politics already is devoted to a great extent to dealing with the consequences of the Great Society, of the turn in public policy in the 1960s that was presaged in some respects in the 1930s and even earlier, but that really took form through the Great Society in the Johnson years, that put in place a set of institutions premised on a very different vision of what American government is for than had ever really been the case in American life. Institutions that try to manage American society, to control American life, rather than to enable it. And those institutions have turned out to be not only dispiriting and damaging to the very people who they were intended to help in many cases, especially the actual welfare portion of the welfare state, and not only practically unworkable in ways that help us to see the problems with technocratic ideas in government, they've also turned out to be fiscally unsustainable, which actually is why they've come to the fore in our politics, because they're becoming impossible to ignore. The problems with them are getting to a place where they're simply becoming unaffordable. This is especially true of our entitlement programs, and especially so of our old age entitlements, and especially the Medicare program, which was created in the Great Society years. A lot of what we're going to have to deal with in the coming years are ways of turning those institutions around and of replacing them with a different set of institutions that are better positioned and better designed to sustain a space for society to thrive, to enable society to flourish, rather than to try to run the United States of America. And so I think that the brief moment of very misguided consensus in the mid-1960s is one that we're still trying to get over now. Oftentimes you hear people talking about that moment as though it were a golden age, where people kind of agreed Republicans and Democrats could get along and then they'd have a drink afterward. What they were doing in that time is basically making a massive mistake. Mm-hmm. And our constitutional system is designed to prevent just that kind of mistake from happening. The incredible supermajorities that the Democrats had in those years and the post-war consensus that the Republicans were also part of in those years made possible a mistake that is very difficult to reverse now that those supermajorities and that consensus are gone. I think we've actually returned to normality in American political life, but that means that fixing the mistakes we made in that exceptional period is proving to be very, very difficult.
I think that's exactly right. But is it literally the case that there's no way out except reform? I mean, there is, to name one, socialism. Mm-hmm. I mean, what are the prospects, if you are on the left, to speculate for a moment, how would you view the impending disaster from the point of view of a socializing and ever more socializing mindset?
Well, I think that there is a group of people on the left who do think that the crisis of the welfare state can be an opening for social democracy. They certainly wouldn't call it socialism, and it isn't socialism in many respects. But for more and more government involvement in our economic life and in our private lives, for this kind of combination of economic collectivism and moral individualism that amounts to the left's worldview at this point. I think that they manage that view by ignoring a lot of what is going wrong with the liberal welfare state. The left today is in much worse intellectual trouble than the right. There's not been an engagement with the problems of the welfare state. There's not an agenda. There's not, if you think about the left, the American left since the 1930s has always had in front of it some big vision, some next thing to do. It would not be easy to say what that looks like now. Maybe it's universal preschool, but that's, that's minuscule by definition. What the next progressive candidate for office, for the presidency, say, is going to have to run on is not easy to say. And a lot of it would have to involve doubling down on things that the public believes not to be working. So I think they're in very great trouble, and they haven't come to terms with that fact. Now, conservatives are also in trouble, because in a lot of ways, Republicans today are offering just another form of the agenda that they offered in the 1980s and 1970s, really. A set of solutions that were designed to address problems of that period in ways that turned government around in the right ways. Some of them were, in fact, enacted, some of them were not, but the challenge we have is to use the difficulties that the country faces to turn our institutions around and to create institutions that are better ordered for the role of government we have in mind. I think Ronald Reagan and the people around him did a very good job of turning the challenges of the late 1970s into opportunities that way. The challenges of extremely high marginal tax rates, of hyperinflation, of overregulation. But today we face different challenges. I wouldn't say that high marginal tax rates are high among the challenges we face. It would be nice to have them lowered, but you wouldn't put them very high on the challenges that a middle-class family faces. Hyperinflation just isn't a fact now. Certainly deregulation can help us a lot, but not in the industries and not in the ways that we're used to thinking about. Conservatives need to think about how to apply our principles to today's challenges, because that's the way both to get the public to see us as a constructive force and to actually make changes that would turn things in the right direction. And so I think what we need to be doing, and what National Affairs tries to do, and what I think more and more people are trying to do on the right, is to apply those same principles to a new set of problems, to a new set of challenges that face American families. And that results in a different policy agenda, in a different agenda of reform that's moved by the same ends as Reagan's was, but that involves different means, because we are living in a different time. There's a way in which both parties now are just vehicles for checking off lists that they've just been holding in their hand for decades. The Democrats have had them since the mid-'60s, the Republicans since the mid-'80s. Everybody's kind of forgotten how we ended up with this list and why. We just know we got to get it done, and that's counterproductive for both parties.
Is one can understand who comes out for a Tea Party rally. Who comes out for a Reform Conservative rally?
Well, we don't really do rallies, I would say it should be the same people. I don't see what people are calling Reform Conservatism. I think of it as just applied conservatism, and I don't see it as in tension with the Tea Party. I don't think that it's an answer to the Tea Party. On the contrary, I think it's an answer to the same problems that the Tea Party is trying to speak to, but an answer that tries to look to policy means to address some of the problems. So in some respects, it's an extension of the Tea Party. In other respects, it's a step that tries to use public policy to deal with some of the problems. The problems are not just problems with the left. They're not just the growth of the state. They're also problems on the right. They're a very comfortable and fat and happy Republican establishment that tries to tinker at the edges in ways that get them in power instead of the other side without any real vision of what it is they want to do. I think that's, in a lot of ways, a bigger problem for the right than the left is, because it involves getting out of certain kinds of grooves and habits that we really have to get out of. The Tea Party is very much a response to that too, and I think that the ideas that have been bunched together as Reform Conservatism are as well. They're populist in spirit, they're populist in end, and in their means they do try to contend with the realities of the welfare state. They try to start where we are and get where we need to go.
And is there enough coherence to the agenda? I mean, is it recognizable and is it appealing?
Yeah. Well, I think that first of all, it is coherent in its definition of problems. It tries to direct itself to the challenges that middle-class families face now, cost of living challenges, barriers that stand in the way of people achieving what they see as a fulfilling and flourishing life. I think it's also coherent in its view of the means. That is, it's anti-technocratic. It tries to use government to build a space in which society can address its own problems from the bottom up. If you think about how conservatives try to go at problems, it is by creating creating an opportunity for people to try different kinds of solutions, to experiment, for people to choose for themselves what's working and what's not, and for people to abandon failures and keep successes. The welfare state doesn't allow for any of that. There's no experimentation because everything is prescripted and regulated. People who are receiving services or benefits are not people who are choosing among options, and nothing ever goes away. Failures stay forever. Moving from one to the other involves a series of policy reforms in one arena after another. So what is school choice? School choice is an attempt to move from a centralized, bureaucratic, technocratic system to one in which the people receiving the service make choices, and everybody who provides that service has a huge incentive to try different ways of giving them what they want. Right? What is the conservative approach to healthcare? It's exactly the same thing. It's moving from a centralized, concentrated, technocratic way of thinking to one where the resources on the table are given to the people in the country, and they choose among options, they keep what they want. And in the process, the underlying system, be it the healthcare system, the education system, gets better because everybody has a huge incentive to gradually and incrementally try different ways of improving at the margins. I think that's how change happens. That's how improvement happens. And so, you know, these are all ways in which we do think there is a role for government, but it's a very different role. The role is to enable this kind of process of dynamic experimentation, to enable people to flourish in their own way. It's a very different way of thinking about what government is for than the welfare state.
I mean, at a very basic level, conservatives of almost every stripe are people who feel something valuable is threatened. And is the threat, both rhetorically and substantively, behind that you discern in the reforming agenda? How would you put that, and can you get people worried?
Yeah, I think the threat is, first of all, a threat to that space, the space between the individual and the state, where we actually live, where society exists. That's the space in which we live our lives. It's the space in which the family is, the space in which civil society is, the space in which the market exists. That space is under threat from government because we have a government that understands its role as clearing out that space so that there's nothing between the individual and the state. The state provides services directly, and there are only individuals in our vision of society, so that at the same time it's hyper-individualistic and it is statist. That's the progressive combination. I think that conservatives believe that almost everything that matters about society happens in that middle space, and happens through mediating institutions.
Certainly, much that matters happens in that middle space.
Yeah, not everything, but almost everything. Yeah. And so that space being under threat is what sort of gets us out of bed, because that means that the core of the American way of life really is in danger. Beyond that, I also think that the threat as it presents itself to the American public a lot of the time is a kind of sclerosis, is a sense that we just can't do anything anymore.
Yes.
We can't get anything done, and government, big as it is, just can't achieve even what it should achieve, let alone all the other things it's trying to do. And that is a result of the same set of factors. It's again a result of an overactive, hyperactive federal government and in some respects even state and local governments that have an exaggerated view of their own purpose, an exaggerated view of their own capacity. I think that what the reformers on the right are trying to offer is an answer to both those problems, is to say we could do a lot more if we allowed more to get done in that space, including what we expect of government. If we allowed the problems that the welfare system exists to solve to be addressed by putting resources in that space and allowing civil society institutions together with public institutions to work to address the problems people have from the bottom up, one by one, it's just more likely to work, quite apart from it being better connected to the principles of American life and government.
Well, Yuval, we shall look forward to more from you, and we'll be watching the success of the reform agenda going forward. And in the meantime, let me thank you for appearing on The American Mind, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.